Meeple Nation Podcast, episode 461, Two-Player Games.
Welcome, citizens of Meeple Nation. For the next 30 minutes, sit back and enjoy.
Meeple Nation Podcast is sponsored by GameToppersLLC.com. So I was thinking about this earlier today, and I realized that our Game Toppers are everywhere. Everywhere we go, we've got Game Topper stuff to play on and use. You've got the two tables set up here. Andy has 3 tables at his house.
Can't you get 4?
If I separated them into 2 separate Moriartys, yes.
Yeah, because they're modular, which is fantastic. We've got mats in all sizes. We can throw them down on the tables. My point is just that we have become so accustomed to using the Game Toppers that it's almost jarring when we don't play with them. The other night we had a game night at a church. We just had those long tables and it worked. It was fine, but it was like, oh, where are the Game Toppers? Where are the nice neoprene mats?
Even at BGG Con or just recently at BryceCon, we didn't have that. When we go to SaltCon though, we take Andy's Mycrofts and set those up on the table. And then it's always a bummer when you got to go play at the table that doesn't have one of those on it.
That's what I was going to mention next is we take them any opportunity we have. Last year when we did the Dig Con, Andy brought all of his tables. We set them up as often as we can and wherever we go because they really are fantastic product. And it is, for us, I think, the way to play. Just the other night we had game night at Andy's house. And I noticed that all of the little kids have been trained now to go and grab cup holders when they take drinks to the game tables, which is also awesome. It really has just become part of game night. The Game Toppers, the accessories, everything, it's just part of how we function and how we game. Berkey has really spoiled us with these fantastic products. He can spoil you too if you head over to GameToppersLLC.com and discover the next greatest game upgrade you need to have, because I can't imagine playing without them.
Need, I think, is correct, because at this point, I couldn't imagine my regular game night without them. It makes such a huge difference. We are the hosts of Meeple Nation. I'm Nathan Howard.
I'm Andy Holliday.
And I'm Douglas Stewart.
Seems pretty quiet with just the 3 of us here. I mean, we're used to Logan not being here, but Dave is missing tonight too. Hopefully he gets feeling better. Whiny bugger.
Well, I mean, he's not feeling well. It does seem like we should be kind of nice to him.
Well, at least he didn't come and get us sick.
Yeah.
So thanks, Dave.
Yeah, podcast nights are not super spreaders.
We have a webpage, and the webpage is full of goodness. There's blogs, there's photos, there are bios of us and our bloggers. There's a link to our Instagram feed. There's a link to Brain Detergent's Music, who provides our music. There is all sorts of goodies to be found at meeplenation.com. If there's anything you feel is missing from there, please let us know. Reach out to us via email at meeplenation@gmail.com. Or if there's any other questions or comments that you have, please reach out. Let us know about your game nights and your gaming experiences. We'd love to hear about those. Also on our website is our Patreon link. We love our patrons. We truly appreciate their support. Those funds help us to continue to do the things we do, give us the opportunity to upgrade some hardware as we need. If you too like the podcast and would like to support us, we'd be very grateful for that too. That Patreon link is on our webpage. This week we are beginning our discussion of two-player games. We've done a couple episodes that you can go way back and find some of those about other two-player games. We figured after a couple years, it's time to do an update. Not every game that we're going to talk about is necessarily limited to 2 players. Some of these games will allow for 2, 4, even 6 players, but we feel that some of these games shine and play best with 2 players. We will begin our list by discussing some games that are limited to those 2 players. As the episode goes, I am sure we will venture out, I'm afraid, probably rather quickly. I don't feel like I play a ton of 2-player games, and I always complain it's tough to play 2-player games. As I was looking through my catalog of games that I own a lot of 2-player games. And I can't talk about 2-player games without paying homage to what actually really started our group together. When I first started to get into the gaming hobby, it started off with Marvel's Overpower, which is a 2-player card game. At that same point in time, Decipher released Star Wars customizable card game, and I dumped way too much money into that. I was able to get rid of my Overpower cards, but for some reason I can't get rid of these Star Wars cards. I know I'm never going to play this again. And I was going through trying to reduce excessive amounts of cards. I just kept keeping way too much. Finally, I just put them in the garage. I got to get them out of my sight. Maybe at some point I will give them a nice Viking pyre and set them down the river and light them afire or something like that. At this point, they still have a sentimental value to me. Our group originally got together playing 2-player games. Then it expanded to Decipher's Star Trek, and several of us were playing Magic at the time. All of these 2-player games is really what kind of brought this group together until somebody introduced Settlers of Catan to our group, and then it kind of untangled from there. Still, several of the 2-player games that I have that I don't play as often, but I still enjoy. Starting off my list is Star Wars X-Wing. Fantasy Flight's kicked out a couple of different versions of this now, a couple of new releases. To me, just screams cash cow, because you got people to pay for it one time, you got people to pay for it a second time, and maybe even a third time. I can't remember if they're on the third rendition or not. But X-Wing, I felt, was a very smooth transition of establishing that space dogfights that, as a youth, just pulled me into those Star Wars movies. And the same thing with the Star Wars miniatures space battles, which included those larger ships and even the Armada, all those that are 2-player games, and even Rebellion. So a lot of those Star Wars games, Rebellion is one of those games that is a 4-player game, but plays like a 2-player game.
You never hear people talk about Rebellion as a 4-player game, though. In fact, every time I've heard it talked about, people have said they do not enjoy the experience at 4 players. It's definitely one of those that technically plays 4, but I don't think you'd be having the best experience it has to offer by a long shot unless you're playing it at 2.
So I've never played Rebellion. So when it plays with 4 players, is it kind of like the, hey, you can be on my team type?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
That's
You
what it is.
you just gave your kid brother the second controller. It's not really plugged in, and he's just playing along with you.
Gotcha.
It does try to separate it. One player's dealing in the space arena and the other player's dealing in the ground arena, still kind of sharing some cards, and it just really doesn't mesh. But Star Wars Rebellion on its own, 2-player game, an outstanding game. But again, and I'm sure we're going to be saying that a lot, is it comes down to it's that 2-player game. And when we get together as a group, that's very, very rare that we have 2 players.
You know, the funny thing is the times that we've had to separate, or we'll have 5 players, right? And oh my gosh, we got 5 players. What are we going to play? I don't know why we don't just bust out one of these 2-player games that we never get to the table because it's a 2-player game. Totally should just separate 3 and 2 and bust through some 2-player games next time that happens.
I totally agree. The issue we run into is somebody is saying, like, you get to go on the 2-player table. The rest of us are going to play over here. I don't know if that's the reason.
It could be. At that point, you bust out an epic 2-player game and joke's on them.
There you go.
I agree with that. There is some truth to what you're saying, but there are some fantastic 2-player games. I think these are probably going to get mentioned in some of our future 2-player episodes, but I'll just throw out really quick. Unmatched, the entire system, absolutely fantastic. You throw a map out on the board, you pick any one of a number of different, very diverse characters. The raptors from Jurassic Park versus Beowulf, or Little Red Riding Hood versus
Daredevil.
Sure. Yeah. Because if you combine the normal with the Marvel, you just use a deck of cards to go head to head, but it's a blast. It's so much fun. It's fast paced. It's high anxiety. You really feel like you're playing a game of cat and mouse with the other player. They're a lot of fun. We'll talk a whole lot more about that one in future, I'm sure, but that is just one example of some really great 2-player games that can hit the table. I really enjoy 2-player games. One of the things about a 2-player game, it's a little more intimate with the other player, and I think it can create a lot of very fun memories with one person in particular. Do you know what I mean? This has happened a lot in my family. My daughters, I remember many years ago when we got our first copy of Lost Cities. Lost Cities is such a simple little card game. You have 5 areas that you can explore, and you begin an expedition to explore those areas by simply playing cards in ascending order. On your turn, all you're doing is playing a card and then taking a card. And there's some nuance to the game with the way you can do the little handshake deals and bet and everything. And the scoring, I think, is really clever because it has, if you start an expedition, you immediately start in debt, get a bunch of negative points. And so
minus 20 points.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're trying to pull yourself out and hopefully score some positive points before the game is done. Those games just go so fast. And I remember playing those with both my daughters, Amberly and Autumn. Play a game, and then it was like, okay, shuffle, play again, shuffle, play again, shuffle, play again. And we did that over and over with both of them. Had so many good conversations at the table. It's a one-on-one setting. That was a game that I think really actually set the hook in them for playing card games in particular, but also for board games. I have a lot of memories like that surround these two-player games.
Two-player games were a hot item for me 15 years ago. I had just started really building on my game collection at that point in time. There was a guy at work that kind of liked board games, so I started buying two-player games, and we would play during our lunch break. That evolved into convincing my wife to play more games, and I was always looking for a good two-player game that I could rope her into playing and trying out. I mean, we played a lot of Dominion two-player during that time, and I think Dominion plays quite nicely as a two-player game. Probably a little bit better with 3 players than 2, but it still plays great. We've talked about this on the podcast before, but she actually went and picked up Pass the Pigs, and we started doing that on date nights. And now, Catan the dice game, I think as a two-player game, it's a great game. Bust that out while we're waiting for our food at a restaurant, and we're rolling dice. People are giving us weird looks, but we're playing this roll and write while we're waiting for our food. And it plays quickly. Typically what we'll do is play one side of the sheet while we're waiting for our food, and then we flip it over and play the other side while we're waiting for the check to show up. We have a ball, and it's fun. So I love the two-player games in particular if they're quick enough to play on a date while we're waiting for food, and with a small enough footprint that we can just have it on the table and clean it up really fast as soon as the food shows up. That's what I like to see in two-player games, because that's typically when I play a two-player game is with my wife.
I have to roll some of my comments back, I guess, because I say I don't play a lot of two-player games. Year 2022, so just last year, I played a total of 1,266 games. Of those games, 769 of them were two players. So more than half of the games that I played were two players. Probably 90% of those games were with my wife, which this year has been awesome. And we didn't really start playing games together until August, July. For her and I to play over 600 games together in half a year, this year, 2023, if we continue at this pace and we don't burn out, I'm going to have 1,266 played with her alone.
So I'm going to have to wash my mouth out with soap after this comment, but that is one of the benefits of online games. Take your turn on multiple games and get a lot of plays in. Excuse me, I've got to vomit now. I do not like online games, but...
People can't see me, but I'm clutching my pearls. What are you talking about, Andy?
We talk about this, and there's been several nights where my wife wakes up 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning to get to work. It seems like it's a race at night that who can take the last turn. I got to make sure that I've taken all the turns on my games, and she's trying to make sure that she ends the night with having to wait on me. There's nights that we've gone till 12:30 in the morning when she's got to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning because she just keeps taking turns and I just keep taking turns. It's been great. We're there together. We're having conversations. We're playing these games. There's no difference between these games being played virtually as opposed to being played in person. Can't Stop is one of my wife's very favorite games. And we played that game alone 100 times.
Played that for the first time just recently. And how does that compare as a two-player game versus, I think we played a four-player game the time that we played?
Doug just recently picked this up. Doug's been super excited about it. I don't like it four-player. I think the game very much shines as a two-player game.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The day that I got it in the mail, I opened it up, busted it out. Lydia and I sat down and we played 3 or 4 games back to back. As a two-player game where you're just quickly rolling your dice and then passing them back and forth to roll and move, the pacing of it is what makes that game really fun because the play is really simple. Can't Stop is a really simple game. If you can keep it fast-paced and moving, it's really fun. When you are playing a game that's that simple and you're kind of waiting for everyone to do their rolls around the table, it slows it down just enough that I think it loses some of its luster. I still think it's a fun game at 4, but it definitely falls into that category of game that just really does shine at 2 players.
So I know this is just a dice rolling game. I don't know if I need to be shamed about what I'm going to say. Andy, maybe I need to wash my mouth out as well. But I think the game loses its strategic value at a 4-player game as opposed to a 2-player game. Because as a 4-player game, there's a lot more chaos on the board. There's a lot more competition on being able to progress at all. Whereas in a 2-player game, I can pace myself a little bit so that if my numbers are on the far end of the scale, near the 2 and the 12, I don't necessarily want to push myself because the chances of me progressing up that track are less likely as opposed to if my numbers are all 6, 7, 8. So I think the game has used my big heavy air quotes there, but I think the game has far more strategy as a 2-player game than it is just a dice chucker at a 4-player game.
I could see that, especially I've only played it with 4 players. There didn't seem to be much strategy at all. Just really deciding when you want to stop and kind of what numbers you're taking. It was pretty apparent from maybe the second round that I wasn't going to win that game, and there wasn't much I could do about it. And that was the luck mostly. My wife was playing that game and she jumped way up one of the tracks. It seemed like her first or second turn, she was almost to the top. I think it was at the 9s. It seems to me also that it would be more fun with 2 players. I kind of got bored waiting for my turn. Probably didn't help that I was getting distracted with other people asking me questions, trying to teach another game. Like I said before, the faster paced 2-player games for me have a lot more appeal when they just play quickly. That being said, there are some 2-player games that maybe have a little more depth. I don't mind that those last long. That's not one I would necessarily take on a date night, but that's one I wouldn't mind playing at the table. Some of my favorite games are only 2-player games. I'm not opposed to that, but generally speaking, I really like the faster paced ones.
And now don't get me wrong, the game is still the same. It's still luck driven at 2 players, just as much luck driven as you're playing at 4 players. I just feel like there is more opportunity to make a sound decision as opposed to in your example where I have to push it no matter what I do because there's already 3 other people that are way ahead of me. And then you have that higher chance of busting and not feeling like you're in the game at all.
So a few weeks ago, you talked about the game High Risk. This reminds me a lot of High Risk. I think it would ruin the game if it were 4 players.
It is a 4-player game, and you are absolutely right. The board is so small, and the number of spaces that are on that board, when you start playing with 3 or 4 people, the board just becomes too cluttered, and all it is a race to get to the next bivouac or to the peak.
And I can imagine you're constantly getting knocked off the mountain. It seems like for a simple game, it would take way longer than it should as a 4-player game. It surprises me that it's a 3 or 4-player game as well. It really does.
Yeah, and it totally sucks the fun out.
For sure.
When we look at some of these games, we've talked about Star Wars Rebellion, Can't Stop, High Risk. I think that's the issue. It does allow for that extra player count, but does that extra player count hinder the enjoyment of the game? For me, Can't Stop, High Risk, Rebellion, absolutely. If you're playing in those higher player counts, 3 or 4 players, the game fizzles. Whereas I think the game shines and is far more enjoyable as a 2-player game.
So another game that I think we've all had a pretty good experience with is Patchwork. And I wish Dave was here and could chime in a little bit because I know he has had a great time playing that with his wife. Patchwork is the game that got my wife into games. I remember when I introduced that game to her, she wanted to play it over and over and over. And we had sessions where we were playing this game that only takes maybe 30 minutes to play, where we were playing for 3 or 4 hours because we were just playing it back to back to back. What a clever little game. Patchwork is designed by Uwe Rosenberg, and it's such a testament to his skill as a designer that he can create these massive, sprawling games like Agricola and A Feast for Odin, and then he comes up with this little gem of a game, Patchwork. The concept of it is just really simple. You've got these pawns, they're moving around a track, and on your turn you can either move your pawn to take some buttons, or you can use your buttons to buy little patches for your quilt. The patches are these little polyomino pieces, and you're just trying to build out an efficient quilt on your little 9x9 grid. This is a strictly 2-player game. It's really nice the way it just goes back and forth, back and forth. There's not a lot of waiting between turns, but it offers a ton of strategic depth. Using your spatial reasoning to try to get your pieces to fit together well. You're trying to noodle out how you want to spend your buttons or acquire buttons. You're trying to make decisions about, okay, if I buy this piece, it takes up a lot of space on my board, but doesn't generate buttons when that phase of the game hits, versus this one that's smaller, but could pay off big because it's going to produce 2 or 3 buttons every time they get generated. You're just making a whole bunch of little tiny decisions that come together in a really fun experience. And frankly, kind of a cute one. It comes in several different flavors. You can buy the original and they have an Americana version, a bunch of versions that play homage to different cultures,
but all
that
play
have
the
different
same
themes, but they all play the same. Just a fantastic little game. And again, going back to these 2-player games that create these really fun memories with one other person. I mean, I will always remember those nights playing Patchwork with my wife.
Yeah, this is one that my wife loves, and she excels at this game. We've played together 85 times. My win percentage on this game is 18%. She just mops the floor with me every time, and I try so hard. I'm working every angle I can to try to get more buttons on the patches I'm putting on my quilt. I'm trying to make sure that I get all the little bonus tiles. I'm trying everything, and it is such a joy when I beat her. And when I beat her, the gap between my score and her score is very minimal, as opposed to the normal games when that gap is quite substantial. And the scoring on the game is a little bit different because you're building this quilt and then you get to the end game and you scored like 7, 8, 10, 15 points at the most.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you do is you take all the buttons. Your buttons are your score, but then you have to subtract, I believe it's 2 points for every square on your quilt that you didn't fill up. You think you've got this mountain of buttons here, and then you look at your board and you're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to lose a lot of points right here.
Yeah, so the most I've scored is 35 points. The highest score my wife has scored is 38. My average score is near minus 20. I mean, that's usually where my score ends up. And it always frustrates me. You know, she's got like 12 and I got minus 15. I got minus 20. It drives me nuts. But she is so good at that game. She's just exceptional at that spatial recognition and being able to see and put those patterns down so much better than I am. And it's a game that she loves. The experience and the playing together. And then there's that chance when I do win that it's like, yeah, it's a moment. I'll live on that for like 10, 15 minutes before we start the next one. But Patchwork is a phenomenal game. One that I have got my wife to play that she doesn't like really at all. Part of it is she's not really seeing the strategy. And this is Hive. Hive is a very simple game where you're going to put these big chunky hexagons on the board and they all represent bugs. I'm going to put one down. My opponent's going to put the one that's going to touch it. And then from then on, any bug that I put down can only touch one of my hexagons. By the time I put my fourth bug down, the fourth bug has to be the queen bee if I haven't played it prior to that. And then the object of the game is my opponent is trying to encircle my queen bee before I encircle their queen bee. The different bugs have different styles of movement. The ants can move as far as they want. You have the spiders that can only move 3, the beetles that can only move 1, but the beetles can actually climb over a different bug. And then there's the grasshopper that can just jump over as many tiles that are in its path. And you use these combinations to try to trap, make it so that your opponent cannot snare your queen bee. When we first started playing this recently, it was very simple. It always turned out whoever went first won because they got the chance to play their bugs and were enclosing it. There's got to be more of this game. So I started to try to manipulate it so that, you know, my wife would get 2 or 3 pieces around my queen bee. Then I would move one of my pieces there so that I could pull my queen bee out. The other thing is you have to make sure that you can just slide the tile. If it ever gets to the point where you can't slide that hexagon out, then it's trapped and then it's really game over for you. But like this last game, my wife had 3 pieces around. She hadn't parsed them out so that I was trapped. Her next piece was going to close it in and I moved my piece over and then I was able to shimmy my queen bee out of that trap before she could put another hexagon in there. The game is very simple, but there is some strategy and it's all about trying to make sure that you leave yourself an avenue for escape, and it's not just an offensive game. Very simple, very portable. There's a pocket version of it that you could take with you to the restaurant as well and play several of those games while you're waiting for your food or your check.
I noticed we have Fantasy Realms on our list, and I'm curious, do you guys think it plays better as a 2-player game?
I do.
I disagree, and for this reason. There are a lot of combinations in Fantasy Realms that you have to have very specific cards, and I've noticed when we've played that 2 players, your chances of seeing those go way down.
Agreed.
Yeah, someone might take that card if you're playing a 4-player game, but they still may discard it and you can snatch that up. It seems like every time I've played a 2-player game, I'm definitely trying for the wrong strategy because I'm looking for specific cards, a specific card, a named card that there is one in the deck that I'm looking for. And I guess maybe the strategy with that game when you're playing 2 players is to not go for one of those strategies unless that card comes out or it ends up in your hand again. Maybe go for something that has more of a generic requirement to get points. Fantasy Realms is a great game, and I've had fun playing 2 players and with 4 players. I think it plays great with all player counts. I've enjoyed it.
I agree that with a higher player count, you do have the opportunity to see more of those combinations and be able to get those cards. However, I'm going to channel my inner Dave, and the game ends way too fast. You have fewer turns to be able to monopolize on those cards. You might have the opportunity to see them, but you're taking fewer turns. And for the possibility of that card being in the discard pile when it comes back to your turn is not as high. For me, enjoy the game far more as a 2-player game. And it is a game of trying to maximize your hand with the cards that are there.
Hearing you two talk about this, one thing I'm curious about, you're both aware that the 2-player game is a variant, right? So it does come with a whole set of different rules. Because if you try to play Fantasy Realms as a 2-player game using the normal rules, it is not very fun. I actually feel like the rule book, they did a good job with that variant because that you actually draft your cards. There's some slight differences with how you discard, the number of cards that can be out.
In the trash.
Yeah, in the trash, and also the number of cards in your hand. I actually have really enjoyed this every time I've played it at 2 players. I do think it's a good game. Fantasy Realms is just one of those evergreens for me. I kind of just like it no matter what.
I totally agree with that too. But in my opinion, I find the game shines more as a 2-player.
I definitely wanted to ask you about that. I wasn't sure who put it on the list. I assumed that you preferred it as a 2-player game, so I wanted to know why.
A 2-player game that my wife and I got to the table recently that I really enjoyed was The Rocketeer, Fate of the Future. Have either of you had a chance to play this one yet?
I have not.
The last time you discussed that, you asked that same question.
Oh, have we talked about this one before?
You made mention of it. None of us had played it, and none of us still have played it, I don't think anyways. But I was interested in it. I didn't realize it was a 2-player game.
Yeah, it is 2-player only. So this is one of those games that is based on an IP, the Rocketeer movie that came out in 1991. So this is an old movie with Cliff Campbell, Jennifer Connelly, Alan Arkin, Timothy Dalton, who is fantastic as the villain, Neville Sinclair. And it's one of those movies that I watched more times than I'd care to admit. I think I had the thing about memorized. What really excited me about this game is how well they were able to capture the essence of that movie and put it into a really fun 2-player tabletop game. This is a game by Prospero Hall. I think most people, when they think Prospero Hall, think lightweight. This one actually clocks in at a 2.6, which for them is a little heavier. So don't make the mistake of thinking this is a really light game. This actually has some good meat on the bone. It's a really fun sort of area control game. You each take on either the heroes or the villains. Each one of the characters that you control has an icon on them, and then the cards in your hand also have a variety of icons. On your turn, you're going to choose which character to activate, and then you're going to use the cards in your hand to sort of boost that activation. Moving around the map, and you're going to places like the Bulldog Cafe and the Seaside Club and the Airstrip and some of those kind of iconic locations. You're going to get a boon when you go to those places, but you're also trying to control them as well as fight your opponents because you are clamoring for control of the rocket blueprints or the schematics for the rocket that Cliff runs around in. But the asymmetry, the theme, everything in this game just works really, really well. That's one that my wife and I, when we played it, we both kind of, when it ended, we both sat back and just went, wow, that was actually a really great game.
What's the playtime on that?
It's a little bit longer. I think with a teach and the first time play, we were at about an hour.
Oh, that's not bad.
And then the second time we played it, I think we clocked it in at about 40. It was probably about 40, 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's not bad at all. When I was in, I think it was junior high school, my buddy brought over a 2-player, it was like a tabletop war game, vinyl mat that had a map with hexagons on it, printed terrain on it. You had rivers and all sorts of different types of terrain on there. Someone plays the Chaos Army and someone plays the Imperial Army. So the game is called Battle Masters. It's a really old game. I still have a copy of this. It's not in the greatest shape. It's one of the original ones that we played when we were kids. You have your men at arms and you have your cannon, and it was just really cool. There's a big tower in the middle. My favorite was to be the Imperials because you have a cannon, a hand of tiles that you almost treat like cards. You shuffle them up. You decide the path that your cannonball is going to take. You're trying to get that explosion to land on your enemies. Put a tile down on a hex in front of the cannon, you flip it over, and it shows, oh, yep, the cannonball's still flying. So you can move to the next space and the next space. And then when you flip it over and it shows the explosion, that's where your cannonball hits. You want that to try to hit on the enemy, and it kills them immediately. And we had so much fun with this game. The cannon was kind of the big bad weapon for the Imperials, and I think it was the troll or the ogre that was the big bad unit for the Chaos Army. The variety of the different units, and there was some asymmetry involved. It was a fun game, especially for the time. It was a lot of fun. I would probably play it now, and it would be more of a, okay, I remember this being more fun than it really was. But as a kid, the imagination that it spurred on, one of the funnest games I had played up until that point, we would finish and we'd reset, we'd switch sides. The next person would take the Chaos Army, the other person would take the Imperial Army, and we'd battle it out again. It played really quickly for the most part and was a ton of fun. Honestly, I should get that to the table again and just see, really, I should just get the game out and see, literally wipe the dust off of it, because I think it's, with the miniatures in there, I couldn't put the lid on, so I think it literally has been collecting dust on all the minis. I probably ought to get it cleaned off and just see what condition it's in and maybe play it with my youngest boy. I think he'd like it. Battle Masters, it was a great game. I had a lot of fun with that one.
So our time is running short, but I wanted to throw out a couple more 2-player only games that I find incredibly enjoyable and would recommend if people are looking for some good 2-player games. Targi. I don't know if you guys have played that one. That one's excellent. Land versus Sea, which I was really surprised by. This is a pretty simple tile laying game. It does have a higher player count variant, but it was designed as a 2-player game. Jaipur, I think, is a classic when it comes to 2-player games. More recently, I have really enjoyed a game called Totemic by Colossal Games, as well as both of the Fox in the Forest games, Fox in the Forest as well as Fox in the Forest Duet. Both offer some really enjoyable 2-player trick-taking that has been pulled off very well.
And I do want to mention one last game as well, one that actually gets played fairly often at my house, and that is Catapult Feud, or Catapult Kingdoms was the original title for it. They have a lot of expansions out for this, different variants to change it up a little bit. The last time that this got played, they played with all of the expansions, and it was a bit much for the boys at the table, the 13, 14-year-olds that were playing. It got to be a bit much for them, keep everything straight. The fact that you're building a castle up, you have guys behind the bricks that you've built up to try to protect them, and you're just shooting cannonballs, trying to knock the castles down and knock the guys down. You get to play cards, gain different abilities, volcano you can put in the middle, Viking ships that you can have, crossbows that'll shoot the cannonballs or your catapults. Anyway, it's a fun game. A lot of laughs. We've had a ton of fun when we've gotten this to the table. In fact, I have several copies of it. Sometimes we'll do a 4-player version, or we'll get a game at each of the Mycrofts side by side going. Just the amount of laughing that happens when the cannonballs start to fly. It is a fun one. If you have younger kids, even the older kids, even teenagers have enjoyed playing this one. It is one I would definitely recommend picking up.
A couple other games that I just want to throw out there. Star Realms. Star Realms has been a great 2-player game. Catan, the card game.
That's a great game.
I think I almost like Catan, the card game, more than I do Catan.
It is better than Catan. Way better.
I agree with that. Carcassonne, the castle. I mean, I think Carcassonne shines as a 2-player game. I've been playing a lot of that 2 players, but there's actually Carcassonne the Castle, which is a 2-player variant that is designed specifically for 2 players, where you're building the wall around the castle and everything goes inside. Another game that my wife and I played a lot of when we were first married was Mastermind, pattern identification game where one person has 6 pegs of different colors and they're putting 4 of them behind a shield, and then the other player has 10 to 12 guesses to try to identify the pattern behind the shield. And this is a game that my wife and I played a ton of when we were first married, when we didn't really have anything else to do. Tally Ho has been a great game that I've played with my kids. Blossoms is a new one.
My wife and I played that one. We liked it okay. One of those games that the theme, I think, what sells it more than the gameplay. But it is clever and has kind of an interesting, you actually play cards on top of cards that represent the stems as you're sort of growing these flowers in pots. And there are some creative things about it. That one didn't shine as a 2-player game quite as much for me and my wife.
And then finally, the one that almost made our friend Jim Clark never come to games again was a game that he and I played called Balloon Cup. Very much a take that kind of a game. It's a air balloon race. On one side of the card, you're wanting to add cubes to get a higher number, and then Once that card is claimed, then you flip it over and you're trying to get lower numbers on there. You can start playing cards on my side, but if it's looking bad for me, I can start playing on my opponent's side so that they're going to lose instead of me winning that race. It was kind of funny. We played one time and then we didn't talk for a while. We were waiting for a youth scout camp thing and we were waiting for the youth to show up, and he and I were just killing some time, and he went and threw rocks, skipped rocks for a while, and it was kind of funny. But I enjoy the game. Balloon Cup, I think, is a very great strategic game. Played it and had fun with it in other experiences, but it for sure has a take that feel and a way to stick it to your opponent. I think we're going to wrap up our first episode of 2-Player Games. Tune in next week. We're going to talk about some more. In fact, we're changing up the way we do things. Instead of each of us picking a 2-player game, we're actually going to go ahead and pick 2 or 3 of our top 2-player games and discuss those. See how our lists relate to each other, and maybe how those lists will relate to you.
Until next time.
We'll see you face to face at the game table.
As always, we want to thank you for listening.
Check out our website. We have all sorts of cool things there. Love those blogs. Get a deeper look into the writing side of Meeple Nation.
Join our Facebook group, Meeple Nation Off Air. I look forward to seeing you there.
Follow us on Twitter, @MeepleNation. We also have Instagram.
Under the same name. We also want to thank our sponsor, GameToppersLLC.com.
We love their product, and they have so much goodness out there.
And we also want to thank Braiding Detergent for our music. Meeple Nation Pod. Wow, let's try that again.
And remember when I said it was going to be smooth?
Yeah, there it is. Right out of the
Slow,
gates.
smooth, and smooth as fast.
This week, we are beginning our discussion of discussing 2-player games. Not even a smile out of Andy. That's a bummer. I even wrote it in there, too.
I caught it. I was waiting.
All twirled down the... it all unweaved...